Wetlands are unique habitats vital for human survival. These are areas that are either underwater or are flooded with water. They include seagrass meadows, mangroves, coral reefs, peatlands, swamps, rivers, deltas, and even lakes. While wetlands provide, among other benefits, to human beings such as water, food, medicine, and also protect the coastlines, they are home to many species. Now, in the Western Province of Zambia, on the Zambezi River, exists one of Africa's greatest wetland, the Barotse Floodplain. I was privileged to meet and speak to Dr. Machaya Chomba on this amazing landscape. Dr. Machaya Chomba is a researcher and a conservationist, then managing the Upper Zambezi landscape. My name is Sophie Mbogwa. Enjoy the conversation. When we talk about the Zambezi, the Upper Zambezi is very important because, of course, of his generation of energy and also in terms of irrigation, food security in the region. But I want us first to talk about the Barotse and how important this floodplains is said to be most important in Africa. Why?
I think I'll start maybe looking at it in terms of three aspects. At a national level, the Barotse Floodplain is the second largest wetland system in Zambia, second only to the Bangoli wetlands in the northern part of Zambia. The Barotse Floodplain obviously has got high biodiversity values. We have critical water beds, for example, like the wattled crane, the open bill stalks, the African skimmer. We've also got obviously large variety of eagles. So in terms of the avifauna of the Barotse Floodplain, it's got over 339 bird species. So because of that, really it's a hotspot for biodiversity. Currently there are over 129 fish species alone, and we think that there could be still more that are not yet documented. When you also look at it in terms of, I think, water values, I think there's an interesting metaphor for the Barotse Floodplain. It's almost like a sponge and almost like a basin type kind of formation, whereby you find that the lowland areas are almost like these lower part of my palms, and then you've got then the margins of the Barotse Floodplain, which then are surrounded by this upper forested area. And because of that, it extends over 270 in length and over 30k in width. Obviously, when it inundates or in terms of flooding, it can reach as high as 550,000 hectares. So it's a massive system that is almost breathing and contracting. You find that when the water comes, it sort of swells and then comes up. So it's, in a way, it almost acts like the lungs of the Barotse basin. And then also another interesting point, which I would also like to state, is that in terms of where the Barotse Floodplain sits, it sits right in the middle of two agro-ecological regions, which are characterized by difference in precipitation, in temperature, but also in humidity. So you find that the Barotse Floodplain then sits in what's called agro-ecoregion 2B. And then upwards of the Barotse Floodplains, where you've got the high rainfall areas, and then below it you've got areas of low rainfall areas. And because of that, you can almost see like a transition between very high rainfall areas and also very low rainfall areas. And in that way, it then sort of acts like a sponge that slowly releases water from these headwaters to the regions that don't necessarily receive a lot of rainfall. And because of that, then it plays this function of water security, not only for the region, the communities, but also downstream communities for the region. And in terms of energy production, we all know that it then also serves as this ecological infrastructure that supplies areas like the Kariba Dam to produce energy. So it's in terms of the services that we receive from the Barotse, you can look at it in terms of the ecosystem services, the provisioning services, the cultural services, but also the water supply services, and it's a massive productive system.
Fantastic. In terms of the tributaries that are empty into the floodplain, but the Zambezi kind of divides the floodplain, but how many other tributaries apart from the Kariba, the Zambezi, not Kariba, how many other tributaries do we get draining into this?
Maybe I'll start with the surface water tributaries, because obviously the groundwater tributaries is another factor. The main tributaries include, for example, the Kabompo, which for us as a program, the Upper Zambezi, we see it also as a very important tributary, because that's the only tributary that flows into the Zambezi that's entirely located within Zambia. So from a national water security perspective, it's in our interest to secure the Kabompo, because we don't know what's going to happen in the other tributaries. So the Kabompo is one of them. Of course, the other tributaries that start off in the Angolan highlands, rivers like the Lungwevungu, the Luanginga and Luambimba, all of these then sort of feed into the Zambezi, just north of the Barotse Floodplain. And then obviously within the floodplain itself, you got then sort of many more tributaries that are feeding in before obviously it starts to flow out. So if you look at it in terms of the sources, water sources of the Barotse, you've got obviously the main tributaries, obviously like I said, who contribute. And in terms of the volume of water, the average volumes of water is almost 872 cubic meters per second. So that's huge compared to other, for example, countries, even in Southern Africa, but even in Europe, they don't get this much of water coming into a system. And then obviously you also have then the precipitation that comes in. The precipitation ranges between 800 to 1,000 millimeters per annum that are flowing into the system. And then obviously we've got the groundwater that are also feeding in. So you've got the surface water, groundwater, but also the precipitation that are feeding into the system. So I think for us, it's really important that we try to understand the flows of water, what's the timing, what's the extent, and how do all of these sort of affect how this system is breathing, and then also supplying downstream communities.
Absolutely. And one of the things I just want to take you back and actually probably understand, because then we have the Kabombo and we have this particular floodplain, and this particularly are located within Zambia. To what extent does Zambia itself rely on these two sources for its water?
The Zambezi basin itself is, I think, the largest catchment or basin in Zambia out of the 7 catchments. And obviously within this basin and within, for example, in the Barotse Floodplain, you've got key sectors, for example, like fisheries, that where, for example, local communities then do depend on fisheries for food security, but also for nutritional diets. We did a study trying to estimate the economic valuation of fisheries really at the landing site. And when I say at the landing site, this is where, for example, communities harvest a fish and they sell. Now, as you know, the value chain of fisheries can extend beyond, for example, them catching the fish and selling it to along the processing, packaging, so the value then sort of increases. At the landing site, we estimated a value of about $4.4 million for the Barotse Floodplain. Now, if you include other sectors, for example, like livestock, if you include other sectors, for example, like the water services that it provides for energy generations, you find that the total economic value of the Barotse Floodplain almost triples. And comparatively with other sectors, you find that it actually competes very well with other sectors, like, for example, even mining, when you quantify all of these sectors like fisheries, livestock, water provisioning, as well as forestry sectors. So in terms of our dependence on the system, it's something that I think as a country we haven't yet really started to quantify it. But of course, I know WWF has been involved in processes like the natural capital accounting system that aims at really understanding our natural capital accounts and how it contributes to our economy. And I think this is a process of actually realizing the full potential of our ecosystem for the country.
And for that to realize that particular potential, one of the key things I've actually seen is the aspect of research. We tend to do research basically driven by outside factors, not necessarily like a country says, say for example Zambia, we have all these resources, but our national plan in terms of by 2030 or by 2050 this is where we want to go, and in terms of food security and in all sectors and mining and stuff like that. But we have this floodplain that is very key to the ecosystem, but we do not tend to really do research in terms of concentrate research geared towards our development and how do we develop, how do we sustainably reach our development goals while making sure that we conserve. Have you seen government driven research, not private sector and not from outside research organizations, Zambian government saying we are allocating this amount of fund to study not just the Zambezi or not just the flood, but the water bodies that we have, the resources that we have?
I think that's maybe I think one of the interesting thing about, I think, these 7 catchments which I mentioned is that the Zambezi catchment, obviously, for a very long time has remained relatively pristine in terms of how much infrastructure development comes in, how much, for example, issues to do with overfishing. So it's really pristine in terms of our human footprint on the ecosystem. But increasingly, there is this new interest now, whether it be, for example, mining, or whether it be, for example, damming, or whether it be, for example, in terms of trying to harness the wetlands in terms of expanding the agriculture. But I think what has lagged behind, as you said, is really the research angle to it, in terms of understanding, for example, what is the impact if we're going to dam several places, for example, on the Zambezi. What's the impact, for example, on these ecological values that we're talking about? So not much, I think, has really been invested, I think, from a country perspective. If you look at, for example, our national budget and how much we allocate to that, is very minimal. I think even less than 10% in terms of how much we invest in research. But I think obviously the scenario is changing. You've got, for example, partners like, for example, University of Zambia, the Barotse University. You've also got other think tanks that are coming in and expressing interest in knowing. And I think as a program, as WWF, what we've been trying to do really is also invest a lot in this research. So a large component of the program is invested in research around environmental flows. How much water does the environment need before we can actually alter fundamental functioning of the system? We've also been trying to do research around issues of flooding versus wildlife movements. We've got partners, for example, like the Zambian Carnival program. We're trying to understand, for example, if the Liwa Plain is flooding, how do wildlife move in response to that hydrological dynamics? Issues of fire, how do they affect, for example, wildlife movements? We've also been doing research, for example, on fisheries. And so far we've done a data set, a 4-year database in trying to understand fisheries dynamics in terms of how much people are selling the fish, what are types of fish that you're catching, and is the fish going down or up. So you're right, you can't manage what you don't know. And I think both from a program and national perspective, it's important that research meets the management needs of these partners like WAMA, like Department of Fisheries. They need to know. So we are there then to provide a bridge in terms of the research informing management needs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Let's talk about the threats. You mentioned the pristineness of this particular floodplain, which was there until now. We found ourselves in a situation where now this is... Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been pleased now to work in this unique landscape for now close to 5 years. And I think what you notice is that the number of threats that we've seen on the Barotse Floodplain, but also entirely on the upper Zambezi landscape. One of them, I think, has been large-scale infrastructure projects, whether it be, for example, in the mining sector. We now know, particularly, for example, in the headwaters of the Kabompo, which is now being coined as a new copper belt because of the increase in mining exploration as well as mining. I think most recently in last year, where we heard, for example, a new commitment by First Quantum Mining and trying to invest more money, a total of $1.3 billion US dollars in trying to upscale the mining efforts around the northwest province there. So obviously that has got a potential to affect key recharge areas and forest areas that, for example, act as supply areas for surface water as well as groundwater. And so obviously associated with mining comes obviously the push for energy. You know, you can't do mining without energy, so you need more energy. And because of that, then there's this new push now for more places where you can produce hydropower dam and so forth. So it's sort of a coupled demand between infrastructure but also the push for energy. And with this energy comes in, you want to then dam several areas. There are a number of sites that have been proposed for damming. One of them is just not far away from where we are. It's along the Sioma Falls. There's a proposed dam there. Obviously an environmental impact assessment was done, but I think from a WWF perspective we would want to really understand how the diversion of water towards the turbines affect some ecological processes, whether it be, for example, the flooding, fisheries, but also the cultural use of that area. So obviously, large-scale infrastructure is one of them. The other threats is also around, I think, overutilization of natural resources. Obviously, as a country, we've grown in population. 10 years ago, I think our population was estimated at 17. We're now slowly above 20 million. So that means that our population is increasing. Now, that increase in population comes also increase in utilization, whether it be for fisheries or, for example, on forests and so forth. You find obviously that communities now are overfishing in certain areas, I think trying to secure that food security. Another key threat is that of certain invasive species that have now invaded the system. And if you think about invasive species like, for example, the Mimosa pigra. The Mimosa pigra is something that 10 years ago on the Barotse Floodplain it was not seen. But over time, over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen that there's been this increase in this Mimosa pigra, and largely because of our infrastructure projects like the Mongo-Tapo Bridge that has caused some areas to be prone or favorable for colonization of Mimosa pigra. The other invasive species is one that's called the Australian crayfish. It's a fish type of crayfish that I think we suspect was imported in Zambia, but also then within the nation then brought in to the Barotse, and it's now also then increasing. And one of the key drivers for that, Sophie, has been the hydrological dynamics in terms of the flooding patterns, then providing this driving force for this Mimosa pigra as well as Australian crayfish to actually spread. And we're doing some research and trying to understand the spread. But we suspect that in a year, the Australian crayfish spread at the rate of 41k per year. Yeah. So that if you look at it in terms of over 10 years, that is something that will increase. So we're doing some research with Rhodes University and as well as the Southern African Institute of Biodiversity. The other one I think has been around agricultural expansion. Agricultural expansion is one thing that I think is also increasing. There's new interest in rice cultivation, new interest, for example, in maize cultivation. So you find that the wetland system now is seen as a place where you can move in and expand your rice and also maize field. At a nation, I think we estimated that 13% of wetland system was lost, and I think I'll need to confirm these values, but conversion of wetlands to agriculture is one of the main threats. Lastly, I think I would say poaching. You find places like, for example, the Floodplain National Park. There's new interest now in trying to demand, obviously, from urban areas like Lusaka as well as other urban areas are pushing for this poaching. Yeah.
And it's poaching of what particular kind of wild animals?
Oh yeah. Of course, I think some of them would include the wildebeest, would include antelopes. Obviously, it also includes animals like obviously snaring of cheetahs, as well as of lion population. Although in Europe we have a very small lion population, but there's increase in this snaring, and when you snare, it's indiscriminate. Whatever you catch in the snare, you get and you sell. Lastly, another threat that I think we've also seen, Sophie, is that of illegal forest logging, driven by international demand for commercial species like the rosewood, the Zambezi teak. And so there's this new emerging market that has come up, and you find that there's the rampant illegal logging, particularly, for example, in Western Province, which has got species like the rosewood, the Zambezi teak as well as in the headwaters. So you find that this is also then reducing our forest stocks. And you find that the Barotse Floodplain, remember, as I said, that coupled loop between the forest and upland, whatever happens in the upland definitely affects what happens in the lowland.
The Australian crayfish and the Mimosa pigra, what is the threat?
I think there are 3 levels of impact of the crayfish. We've seen it from other systems like Kafue, whereby the crayfish has now totally expanded and it's established itself. In the Barotse, it's still, I think there are a few pockets of hotspots and it's slowly increasing. But the emerging finding that we're getting from the research that we're doing, for example, with Rhodes University and SIAB, is one, it's its impact on the juvenile fish species. When the native fish lay their eggs, it goes there to obviously feed on the eggs, but then also feeds on the juveniles. So you find that the ability for the fish to repopulate and respawn definitely then is affected because of that predation of the crayfish on these eggs and juveniles. Then the other one is also on the catch of the fishermen. You find that obviously within the catch, the crayfish is there. It obviously then starts to feed on the catch, and you find that then on the value, it reduces the value of the species of the fish. When you take it to market, it's a damaged catch, and therefore then it affects then the economic value that communities then can harness from the fish that are trying to catch. Then the other one is also the time lost. You're trying to sort out because it's got claws, and then it's sort of closes itself in the fish net. So then the time it takes then to sort of take it out, then you lose a lot of time. You find that where communities were spending an hour to get their fish, they're taking more close to maybe 2 hours. And of course, these are values that were yet to really determine. But from the surveys we've been doing, communities are actually then complaining about that. In terms of the Mimosa pigra, I think one of the lessons that we learned, and we're doing this with an organization called Birdwatch and the International Crane Foundation, and what we've found out that is growing at a rapid rate because of one, it germinates. It's the amount of seeds that it produces are a lot, and also the germination rates, it's got very high germination rates, but then also the rate at which it grows is also quite high. So you find that once it colonizes an area, it then introduces and outcompetes the native vegetation. So you find that, for example, certain areas then can just be colonized, and you find that the available area where communities then can access and feed their livestock are not available for them. And then it starts then to slowly change this ecosystem functioning of the system. But Sophie, this is something that you can only know because these are slow moving variables, the crayfish and as well as the Mimosa pigra. And it's important for us then to understand before it's too late. Before we have places, for example, like the Kafir, which in 5 years' time, the cost of managing it now is lower than the cost of addressing the problem. Yeah, and so we're trying to take advantage of this unique window that we have in trying to clear the Mimosa pigra, such that if in 5 years' time we find that actually the cost of actually clearing can actually even be maybe triple that of addressing the problem. So it's timely and requires knowledge, but also requires the communities as well.
This is very interesting because you find that we need development,
yeah,
but now development is opening up all these areas and opening up exotic species or even foreign species that do not belong to this ecosystem. But before we talk about the balance, let's talk about the value, like for example, in terms of this bridge, and let's also combine the other infrastructure, big infrastructure, for example, the Kazungura bridge that has actually happened in the upper area and stuff. Let's talk about those infrastructure, and in terms of especially opening up this western region and the neighbors.
I think obviously as a country, I think development is important, and I think obviously I think the vision of the country is that by 2030 we're a middle income country, and I think these are things that everyone really aspires to. But I think one of the things that I think is also important is also trying to understand I think how these large-scale development projects really affect certain fundamental ecosystem processes, and trying to understand, okay, how are the two linked and what's the cost benefit of the two. I think in most cases, especially politicians, I think are motivated, and obviously because of several reasons, are motivated by short-term economic benefit without, I think, understanding the long-term impact on these ecosystems. And like I said, ecosystem processes, whether it be, for example, the Mimosa pigra or the crayfish or alteration in the hydrological, are slow moving variables, such that once they change fundamentally, it's a huge cost to actually then sort of return and restore them. And I think the challenge right now is understanding the short-term economic benefit versus a long-term ecological cost that ultimately will also then affect those short-term benefits that you're going to get. As I said, for example, if you talk about the economic value of fisheries, and if you alter that, you're definitely then going to have situations where the communities don't have food because obviously the fish has gone down. But meanwhile, you did a short-term development project. So I think maybe the challenge right now, especially for I think for countries like Zambia, but even for regions like Western Province of Barotse land, is really trying to understand that we need to develop, but just understand the cost benefit. And I think Western Province, as there's this new need to open up to develop, and there's this thirst among local communities for employment, for development. And I think, for example, the Mongo Tapo Bridge opens up new areas of markets, has opened up new areas where people previously did not have access to market. But then that means that this new access to market and accessibility then brings in new pressures, whether it be poaching or overfishing, all these things that come up. Something that maybe has also come up in our work, especially when we talk about the Barotse Floodplain being inscribed as a World Heritage Cultural Landscape, has been the issue of mining versus inscription. And I think that example really brings that sort of dilemma, I think, very, very clearly. The inscription is whereby, as WWF and National Heritage Conservation Commission, we're trying to recognize at an international level that the Barotse Floodplain has got key values, whether it be, for example, the rich heritage and culture of the Lozi people, or whether it be, for example, the network of canals, or the traditional royal mounds where each Litunga is buried and becomes a sort of a place whereby the past Litungas are interfacing obviously with the people around the community. And that inscription for us offers an opportunity for increase in ecotourism, which I think people can come in, see the huge biodiversity, the rich heritage, and can also be a place whereby entrepreneurship increases. And we think that that potential is there. But of course, within a World Heritage Cultural Landscape, mining cannot be done. And therefore, during our consultations, both with local communities, with the traditional leaders, but also with governments, that conversation has really come in to say, if we go through inscription, there will be no mining. And I think the two sort of are head to head. Our argument is that there are places we're not against mining, but just need to do mining in the right places. Obviously, in such a ecologically sensitive area like the Barotse Floodplain, but also where our heritage is, maybe there are certain places where we should say mining shouldn't be done. Let's do mining in other areas. So we need to reach a point whereby large-scale developmental projects can be done, but also recognizing that we need to preserve these ecologically sensitive areas, but also culturally sensitive areas in a sustainable way.
You're taking me to the whole issue of now how land use within this particular area has changed. Initially, the Lozi people, they would just migrate from the plains to the higher ground, but we have forests and all that. But as population grow, how is the land changing?
Some of the main land use activities on the Barotse Floodplain obviously has been agriculture is one of them, where communities cultivate their crops in tandem to these rainfall, but also flooding patterns. Then you've also got, for example, forested areas where, for example, this is where we do our upland vegetation. We also then utilizing the timber logging and so forth. So, but I think one of the key drivers of land use change on the Barotse Floodplain, one of them is obviously agriculture conversion. So you find that these new areas where the floodplain initially used to reach its full extent, you find that obviously there's this new encroachment, if I can use that word, in terms of agriculture. The other one obviously has been, a key driver of land use change has been changes in I think what I can call climate variability. The floodplain is influenced both by timing and extent of the rainfall and the flooding. And because of this sort of extremes of where, for example, in one season we've got, for example, too much rainfall, in the other season, for example, we've got maybe say less water, you find that the ecosystem processes of the floodplain tends to be altered. You find that in one season one area is not fully inundated, and therefore it sort of then shrinks in terms of the actual inundated area. You find that in another season then too much water, but maybe in a shorter period of time, then sort of fundamentally changes. Of course, the other one has been obviously key policies, whether it be, for example, how we manage our wetland system. And I think this also points down to our the capacity of our institutional framework and policies to manage wetland system. There is still a gap, unfortunately, in the management of wetlands, largely because of two things. One, wetlands fall under customary land, and therefore, because of that, the institutional structure to govern wetland areas is often not very clear. Because, for example, areas like, for example, a national park, this is state land. You find that, for example, departments like the Department of the National Park then have a very clear mandate over that area. But for wetlands, they fall really under customary land. So you find that the jurisdiction of the institutions actually to manage these wetlands, the presence at the ground is often not there. So you find that also there's also fragmentation in terms of how the wetlands need to be managed. Wetlands are multiple resource systems, whether it be fisheries, whether it be birds, whether it be, for example, agriculture. And because of this segmentation of these laws governing these multiple resource use systems, it's not very holistic. And you find that there is really no, for example, a clear role of institutions in how wetlands used to be managed. On the ground, for example, the Barotse Floodplain is recognized as a Ramsar site, but the institutions, for example, like the Zambia Environment Management Authority, don't really have a lot of presence on the ground here, because Ramsar is supposed to be managed under ZEMA, but in terms of presence on the ground, it's often not there. The other one, I think, obviously has been anthropogenic activities like unregulated forest fires, whether it be on the floodplain itself, but also on the margins, also affect how wetlands also function. Currently, the fire management on the Barotse Floodplain, we don't have a fire management plan, and even as a country, we don't have a fire management strategy. And I think for wetlands like the Barotse, you really need that holistic fire management strategy, because fires really manage that. They influence this ecological, hydrological, but also human interaction. Fires then affect how much, for example, nutrients are released in the system, that then determine how fish is going to spawn. They also then affect, for example, the forest cover. But unfortunately, I think there are sort of missing gaps that we have there.
With the introduction of more of wheat in the floodplain, actually compared to what they used to do sorghum and millet before, how does that affect the ecology of that particular floodplain? For
a very long time, according to the Lozi calendar, which extends to about 13 months, so that's also very unique. And in each of the months, there was an illustration. For example, January is Sope, February is Yoa, up to all the way up to the 13th month, which is called Skwet. So you find that in each of all these months, there was an indication of the types of land use activity, whether it be, for example, it's time for sowing of maize, it's time, for example, for harvesting, it's time, for example, for reintroduction and movement of livestock. So there is this sort of unique dance between the hydrology and sort of the land use activity. For crops, for example, traditionally, I think cassava is one of the I think the main crops that was historically planted on the Barotse Floodplain, because it's very climate resilient. So there are three types of agricultural fields on the Barotse Floodplain. There are areas for example, on the riverbed. Once, for example, the water has receded, it opens up new areas, for example, where maize then is cultivated. And this happens almost, for example, in November, December. So that's almost like these fields that open up, for example, when the flood recedes. Then you've also then got that transitional zones between the low area to maybe slightly higher fields. And then these are also areas, I need to confirm this, but these are Mazulu. is another type of gardens where, for example, then maize then is planted somewhere around, for example, January, February. After, for example, you've harvested the one that you had planted at the in the Litapa, which is more in the lowland. And this is interesting in the sense that when the rains start in December, up to, for example, in maybe mid-January or end of January, you've harvested the maize that was found in the Litapa. You then grown the maize in the Mazuli. So that when the water then is starting to increase at the peak of, let's say, March and April, that other maize that you've planted on the slightly higher mounds, then you sort of then harvest. So then you've got now, it's almost like these different gardens that are contributing differently in terms of food security, in terms of maize, or there be millet or sorghum. But because of climate variability in terms of the timing when the onset of rains comes and the flooding, it sort of disrupts all of the timing in terms of when they sow and when they reap. Particularly for this year, we started receiving a lot of rainfall in January, February, and the peaked around February, such that those who had planted in the Litapa, meaning that they were at risk now of their maize being completely been flooded, and therefore then it affects their ability to be food secure in the next season. So you find that the timing in terms of when these crops are grown, and in terms of what variety of maize, for example, can be grown in response to this new timing, it still needs to be more resynced. And I think that sort of then has got implication on food security, I think, for the nation. You've also got other types of crops, like, for example, pumpkins that are mostly harvested once, for example, the floodplain has receded, and there's just these new grounds of moist soil, very fertile, and then you've got huge pumpkins that are harvested. And again, this is a source of food security. So back to your question in terms of, I think, the types of crops. I think there's need for new alignment in terms of what varieties can be grown, whether it be maize, whether it be sorghum, or even, for example, whether it be cassava, that are now in sync and aligning with this new sort of timing of flooding and precipitation, but also in terms of volumes, and how we can then make sure that our communities are now sort of responding to these new patterns.
Interesting. What needs to be done?
It's about putting communities back at the center of the management of natural resources. If I could rank them, that would be the first one. Communities live, understand, and utilize the resource. Because of maybe the context of most areas, whether it be Western Province, Zambia, but also even other countries as well, there was that systematic removal of communities from the management of natural resources. But I think it's really about putting them back around it. So I think new forms or models of how communities can be organized, can be capacitated, can be supported in managing natural resources is one of the things that needs to be done. The other thing I think that needs to be done is that we need to take the role of traditional leaders seriously. In most cases, the formal governance systems don't really reach communities in a very meaningful way. So you find that there's really a gap to the extent at which formal governance systems or departments can actually reach and interface with the communities. And the traditional leaders really are there at the sort of the cutting edge between the communities and natural resource management issues. So how then do we, for example, meaningfully work and collaborate with the traditional leaders? The other one, I think we mentioned it, in terms of land use planning. We've got several documents that don't speak well to each other. For example, documents like the district development plans versus general management plans for whether it be national parks, game management areas or forest reserves. How can the two speak together? And I think that's one way in which we try to, I mean, listen, if you're managing a park, if you don't also are not mindful what happens outside the park, then you're only doing half the job. So how then do you sort of support the planning within a national park, but then also the planning around the park as well? And I think this also then brings into question something that we spoke about earlier, investment pathways for places like the Barotse Floodplain. What kind of investments for the landscapes do we want? Is it mining? Is it tourism? So there needs to be these investment pathways or scenarios where we say, in this area, I think the niche here is tourism, and how can we attract and I think stimulate this investment in this particular area. I think the other one, research, obviously, more deliberate efforts, homegrown solutions by Zambians, by our local researchers in making these innovations. There's a huge gap in knowledge around for example, the status of fisheries biodiversity, around the status of forestry biodiversity. So we need more resources to actually generate knowledge to inform ourselves in terms of how we manage. Lastly as well is that we need more budget allocation to key departments in terms of their capacity to actually do the job. You find that departments like Department of Fisheries don't even have any budget for example, law enforcement or patrols in these water bodies. So we need more budget allocation to fisheries, forestry, water resources and so forth. So of course there's variation to the extent to which each department has got the money, but I think we need more concerted effort towards that. Obviously, related to the issue of capacity, Sophie, is also how we harness the economic utilization of resources. What I mean by that is the value chain of resources. You need to loop the management with the economics of the resource. For example, fisheries. We all know that, for example, fisheries produces a huge amount of revenue, and government does collect some revenue, whether it be maybe along the fish control, the fish levy. How is that resources looped back into the management of natural resources? So you find that in all sectors, whether it be fisheries or forestry, that looping back is missing, meaning that we're managing resources without actually the finances to actually optimally manage the natural resources, because we're not understanding the economics and the management and putting them together.
I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Moving forward, I'll be doing another episode looking at the Lozi people and their culture and how they've actually used this culture to coexist together with this particular floodplain. So if you haven't subscribed, so please remember to subscribe and also to share and also leave us a comment. My name is Sophie Mbogwa.